Evolutionary Underground, episode 45 coming your way. This is going to be a fun one. We're going to talk about which DHT derivative steroids should I add to cycles. So this one, Monster and I, we're going to talk about DHT derivative steroids. What are they? We're going to talk about advantages and why you should and can use DHT steroids. Side effects of using DHTs and why we recommend Geneza Pharma. Let's first talk about what is a DHT steroid. So, a little bit of the science. So, when they first started playing around with hormones many, many years ago, we're talking about what, almost 100 years ago, and even longer in some cases. But once they started to really delve into it, what they started to figure out is they could kind of extract DHT, dihydrotestosterone. And dihydrotestosterone is a very important male hormone that we develop, and it's what gives men's penises when we are in being developed in our mother's stomach. And over time, DHT as we get older gives us some man-like features and separates us gender-wise from females. So DHT, when it comes to steroids, is they basically extract that hormone and it's called a DHT derivative. Now, DHT derivatives have certain traits about them, advantages, disadvantages, good, bad, and we're going to talk about that. But the cool thing about these DHT derivatives is these steroids that we're going to talk about that Geneza Pharma has provided do different things and have different side effects and have different benefits. So it's really cool the way these chemists over the years have really played around with these hormones. And there's a many DHT steroids. We're going to talk about on this podcast later on. We're going to talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different ones that you can get from the Geneza Pharma. But Mobster and I, look, we were researching additional DHT steroids that aren't really common. And there were several out there that were developed by chemists over time. You too could go study chemistry, work
Yeah.
at a university, and develop your own DHT steroid. But the thing is, the 7 main ones that we're going to talk about, those are the ones that are used in bodybuilding and by gym rats and by those of us out there. So these other ones that they've developed over time and called different things, we don't really have a purpose for them. So really, nobody uses them. So this we're going to stick to the 7 top DHTs in this episode. But look, DHT derivative steroids, there's a method to the madness. There's a way you should stack them. Because if you stack too many, it can be counterproductive. And if you don't stack them, it can also not be productive to your cycle. So there's definitely a method to the madness of stacking them. Now, when you use DHT steroids by themselves, they don't really do much. In most cases, some of them, which we're going to talk about, you can run by themselves and they do have benefits, but most all of them don't have benefits because DHT steroids, they've really been modified to the point where they don't have a lot of traits of other anabolic steroids like testosterone, like Dianabol, like Trenbolone, like Equipoise. They don't have a lot of those traits that make those steroids be able where you can run those steroids by themselves. These you run them by themselves, you're not necessarily going to have the best results, with the exception of Anadrol, which we're going to talk about later in the podcast. Mobster, go ahead.
So just a history, we've touched on this before on other shows when we talked about the history of testosterone, testosterone derivatives, development, and so on and so forth. Steve's quite correct. I did the same research that Steve did, and I think we were talking about 20, Steve, there were maybe a little bit less total DHT derivative steroids. This is on Wikipedia, by the way, quite a good list with articles on each and every one. So the reasons why, as Steve infers, some of these didn't go anywhere was that other steroids, DHT derivatives in this case, did a better job, medically speaking, never mind for performance enhancement. So there were 2 similar, and one was slightly better overall with less side effects, or just easier to dose, and so on and so forth. I believe there was a couple listed that were borderline pro-hormone type things. In other words, they were steroids, but they were part of the whole pro-hormone debacle. some years ago, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, 9 times out of 10, Steve, it's for medical use. And if something did or treated a condition better, more effectively, and so on, then that's the reason why one product ended up going to market and another one was either tested and just didn't come up to scratch or just didn't go to market. You can even have sometimes, Steve, where Big Pharma literally get their product out first and another company comes along with a very similar product. And because they arrive second, they just never end up making it and they get dropped. So that is a huge part of that. It's interesting to see these other steroids, as Steve says, there's chemists out there, that's what they've been doing, almost a competition back in the day to get your product out, to market product, just have doctors prescribe your product. And sometimes it just doesn't work. It doesn't get to market, the doctors don't pick up on it, the hospitals aren't using it, and so on. I think in terms of performance enhancement, we use these steroids differently. And again, it comes down to, and I think Steve was inferring with regards to the idea of optimizing, being optimal. So if you're bulking with, as Steve said, the exception of anadrol, most of these steroids, DHT derivatives, are better for dry gains or lean gains or for strength, for preservation of muscle, for preservation or enhancement slightly in the case of one of them, your conditioning, your athletic ability versus pure out and out gains. And as Steve said, if there's a magic, it's the combination of this, of anabolic steroids in the right ratios, which people like to argue the toss about. For example, if a person wants to put on 5 or 10 pounds, there's some great examples here that are good for 5 pounds. There are better examples for hardening your muscle. There are others that are great in preservation of muscle while you're doing a cut versus out and out growth, out and out maximum strength and size. And so this is why we're talking about these products today. And obviously, companies like Geneza are providing you with these products because people want to. Not every person wants to be the size of a house, Steve. Some of them just want to look good and be hard and be lean. And in fact, I'd actually argue that this probably applies to the majority of people that go to the gym and train and might use PEDs versus us crazy freaks that want to do 400, 500, 600 pound bench presses or have 20+ inch arms. So in fact, arguably the majority of our audience should pay attention today, if only because the vast majority of people that train and work out want what these drugs, these steroids do, as opposed to sheer size, great mass, etc., looking like a Mr. Olympia freak. Great fun to look at, Steve, can be inspiring, but most people don't want to look like that. Back to you.
So our bodies produce testosterone, and about 10% of that testosterone will convert into DHT every single day. And this happens in your skin, it happens in your prostate, and it happens in parts of your body like your liver. So the more testosterone that you use, or the more dianabol that you use, the more of that not only is going to be converting to estrogen, but it's also going to be converting to DHT. So when we talk about the side effects of DHT, it's important to remember that just because you're not using a DHT derivative doesn't mean you're still not going to get side effects, because these other steroids that you're using also will convert to DHT in the body. And your body's also naturally converting DHT in its body as well. So it's a constant process. And one of the things that you'll know when a child is going through puberty is that when you have DHT going on, that's when your penis starts growing, your scrotum starts growing, you start developing facial hair, you start developing body hair, you start getting prostate growth, and these types of things happening. And that's the development of the male and the different things that can happen. So at the end of the day, it's important to remember when you're using these anabolic steroids to make sure that when you're getting an overabundance of DHT, that it can be a negative. So you just want to get the right amount, and that's why we want to talk about. But first, before we get into the side effects of DHT, let's talk about the advantages of using a DHT steroid. Now, DHT derivative steroids cannot and will not aromatize into estrogen. So right off the bat, that's a big advantage. So if you're prone to estrogen problems and you've used testosterone before, you've used Dianabol before, and you've gotten the different type of estrogen side effects. By using a DHT steroid, you can avoid that. So, what are the estrogen side effects I'm talking about? It can range from water retention. It can be gynecomastia, which are bitch tits. It can be things like it's a domino effect. You start losing energy throughout the day. Imagine going through your day carrying a bunch of water on your back. Of course, you're going to have poor energy. It's going to affect your sleep at night. It's going to cause your resting heart rate to go up and make you more tired and put strain on your organs. So there's a lot of side effects that come with higher estrogen, not to mention the effects it could have on your libido, on your mood, on depression, on all kinds of things where your estrogen levels get out of whack. So by using a DHT derivative, you don't have to worry about estrogen going up. And the thing is also, let's say you are using Dianabol or you are using testosterone, you can throw in a DHT steroid as part of that stack, and it will compete for those estrogen receptors and it'll kind of eat them up. It's kind of like playing Pac-Man. You see, Pac-Man goes around, he eats the little things, okay? And that's what happens when you're using these DHT derivative steroids is they eat up that estrogen. So we've seen guys lately experimenting with different DHT derivatives and saying on the forum, like, wow, I have years where I've had problems with estrogen running testosterone. I added a little bit of Primo, or I added a little bit of Masteron, or I added a little bit of Winstrol or Proviron. And wow, my estrogen issues went away. I didn't even have to use an aromatase inhibitor, such as aromasin or 8X. I didn't have to use those on AI because the DHT derivative took care of the estrogen. So that's a really cool benefit of why you should consider using a DHT steroid in your cycle to help offset the estrogen issue, especially if you're using testosterone or Dianabol. Go ahead, Mops.
Yeah, we literally, I believe, over the weekend, certainly Friday, Saturday, Steve, had a Fred topic. The Fred topic title was Steroids Give Me Heart Failure. And when you actually look, it's a very dramatic title. And when you actually looked at the Fred itself, that wasn't the truth. The person hadn't had heart failure. They hadn't had to go to hospital. They hadn't required medical attention. No paramedics was called. What they were actually referring to is exactly what Steve was just referring to. They had taken what we call a wet steroid. Most of these are what we call dry steroids, meaning that they had had estrogen issues. They had had water blow. They had put on a lot of weight and they felt very lethargic, exactly like Steve just described. So what he actually meant, bless him, if nothing, it was a bit dramatic to say the least, Steve, was he had added a lot of quote unquote water weight very quickly and felt tired in doing so. And not unsurprisingly, Steve, because we have seen people that are especially susceptible if the body fat percentage is a bit too high and then they add water weight, and we have seen numbers like 10, 15, or even 20 pounds. I've talked about this in the past. Of course, you're going to feel breathless. Of course, your heart is having to work harder. I've described this before. The fairy godmother analogy applies here. If I waved my wand and I throw 20 pounds onto you, muscle or water, it's hard work. You will feel more breathless. You will feel more tired. You will have to physically work harder just to do what you normally do. So there's 100% reason for using DHT derivatives to not have these issues, to feel better. But I will say, Steve, to be clear, and we emphasize this when we talk about products and side effects and cycles, I would argue here, Steve, when it comes to using a DHT derivative to get the best, it is better if you are in condition, and I mean physically cardiovascular, but also relatively lean. And kind of that's what you're aiming for. You don't want water weight. You want dry gains. That's what you're looking for when you use DHT. So yeah, quite the title, Steve. We all kind of responded to that particular one. I did think, had he been posting from the hospital bed with electrodes attached to his chest, perhaps we might have been talking about actual heart failure. What he actually meant was he put his body under a great deal of stress by adding too much water weight too quickly. Blood pressure would have gone up, heart rate would have gone up. I would actually argue, Steve, That's kind of what you did to yourself. You took the steroids, you made the bad choices, and obviously we responded in terms of dosages, cycling, and different choices. I think I actually did say you didn't have heart failure.
All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about with the advantage of using DHT steroids is the binding of sex hormone binding globulin in the body, SHBG. And SHBG is one of the things that our bodies have. It's sort of a survival mechanism. I've always referred to it as that because if you understand the way humans have evolved, our ancestors, um, did not benefit them to be super muscular, super strong, and Homo sapiens were able to conquer the other human-like species, such as Neanderthals, for example, because we used our brains. We didn't. And Neanderthals were much stronger. Female Neanderthals are way stronger than male Homo sapiens, but it didn't pay off for them. It didn't help them navigate a very cruel world. And one of the reasons for that is because Homo sapiens were able to really figure things out and be able to find things out. So one of the things that helped us was this SHBG that we evolved having, and many animals on Earth are the same way. And what happens with the SHBG is it's kind of a plateau. It blocks your ability to put on a ton of strength and put on a ton of muscle. This is why bodybuilding is hard. This is why bodybuilding, you can't just jump into bodybuilding and a week later you look like Arnold and a week later you're as strong as Mobster. It doesn't work like that. It takes years and years and years of grinding and working your ass off. And yes, using these steroids to get you where you want to go. And the SHBG, by dropping SHBG, by binding to it, it allows the synergy and it allows you to break down those barriers when it comes to muscle growth and gaining strength. So one of the things that DHTs can do is make the entire cycle work better and also make the other steroids within the cycle work better. Mobster, you want to touch on that a bit?
Absolutely, Steve. Guys, one of the things we'd like to argue, I won't say argue, it's actually a pleasure, really, Steve, is that we can spend somewhere between $500 and $1,000 on a cycle. That seems to be the average. And the idea for, I think you and I both use this phrase, getting the best bang for your buck applies here. It means you do less cycles, you can use less, smaller dosages, and you will get arguably better overall results. Now, obviously, your nutrition and training need to be on point. You need to be using doses that are specific to you and your requirements. But again, I use, for example, Steve, because you and I did a show on this, I think, about a year or so ago, hadn't done to that point, hadn't needed to do that point, but I've started pretty much running Proviron with every cycle that I've done since, purely and simply because it means I can keep the dosages where they were before, but still be getting more from that cycle in terms of more free testosterone. And arguably, Steve, the total testosterone and more free testosterone from that total testosterone is what it means that my cycle will work better. We used the analogy before of putting better fuel in your car and getting better mileage and your car running smoothly, but it's still the same amount of gas that you put in. It's still the same car as it was before. Think of it in those terms. And again, guys, who hasn't got crazy amounts of money? Unless you're lottery winners, you've got the same money as everybody else, same kind of level of income, and the idea of getting more for your money must appeal for you. And the idea of taking a shortcut, if you like, Steve, in terms of better gains, better strength, leaner muscle tissue, and better overall results without forcing yourself to have to take 1.5 grams or 2 grams a week must be something that's appealing in terms of just having more free testosterone because of the SHBG. I will also say, because Steve and I have talked about this before, Steve's quite correct. There are arguably, Steve, limiting factors in certain particular things. As an example, if you was able to double your body weight in terms of just 100 pounds of muscle, your connective tissue, your bones, your intestines, in terms of your ability to digest the food, just to fuel that 100 pounds would be an issue. As an example, again, we human beings kind of have a sensible range of somewhere between 100 pounds. I would argue the normal range is between 100 and 200 pounds for an adult male, somewhere in the middle. And the idea of adult males walking around at 400 pounds athletically and muscular is possible, but incredibly rare. And in terms of your ability in nature, specifically historically, to run after game, to search for food to eat, to procreate, to live, is not easy when you weigh 400 pounds. So the
How about
we
climbing a tree? Because
a
that's where
tree just to escape from a predator. Exactly,
well,
Steve.
well,
So,
before we came down to the ground, we were in trees.
oh
So if you
Christ,
were
yeah.
big, if you grew big, then you would just
You
fall
require more
and get
food. You
eaten.
require more water. You literally chasing after the women would be difficult. So the reality of the situation is we almost have to think in those terms biologically now, even obviously things aren't quite that way, because we're trying to add muscle and we're trying to do it arguably unnaturally. It's not natural to go to the gym and lift weights. Primitive man didn't go around doing that sort of stuff. Maybe as a masculinity, that's it. To prove you were a man, you lifted a stone. But you wasn't doing it for an hour pleasure. You didn't put veins on and try to get a split in your chest as a primitive man. We do these things unnaturally. The food that we eat, protein, is an unnatural level. And we are arguably trying to force a process of more muscle. We are trying to force a process of being unnaturally lean, i.e., typically under 10%, and so on. So there are, for example, Stephen, the same thing would apply to the car analogy again. We've talked about revving your engine all day long and red lights all over the dashboard lighting up. We are trying to create a situation that forces muscle to grow, drops body fat, looks a certain particular way, which is a percentage of the population that's quite small. And therefore, there are limiting factors in your body. For example, Steve, and there are actual medical conditions connected with obesity. Some people, I think it's called Prader-Willis syndrome, do not know when they're full. And so these are the people that are 400, 500, 600 pounds body weight or more, and they literally have no sensation of when to stop eating. The rest of the population does it because we can, but typically we'll stop at some certain point and feel sick or whatever else. The same kind of limiting factors are there inhibiting crazy levels of muscular growth. And again, guys, if you do a manual job and you've got 25-inch arms and 40-inch thighs, some of your jobs would be impossible. Certainly, as Steve says, climbing into the tree as a primitive man. So this is the reason why these things exist in nature. It's actually preservation of the human race and so on and so forth. But we don't have these inhibiting factors. There's no lions chasing after us. There's no predators trying to grab us out of the tree and eat us. And of course, we are trying in our own particular way for our own reasons to look a little bit freaky and a little bit different from the average Joe or Jane. And we are trying to sneakily, if you like, Steve, reduce some of these limiting factors by increasing free testosterone, working out how we can eat a certain way to create a certain situation, and how we can work hard in the gym without absolutely destroying ourselves and force the body to get muscular, force the body to get stronger, and so on. And again, that would be the majority of our listeners. So these are those little secrets. These are the reasons why we discuss these things. And this is knowing this stuff will help you improve, hopefully, Steve, and especially using Geneza products to do so. Back to you.
All right, so let's get into the side effects of using DHT. So, unfortunately, there are side effects. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. These are powerful hormones. They do come with side effects. Now, when DHT converts in the body, it can give you a lot of side effects. When you're taking the actual direct derivative DHTs, as we're going to list on the next segment, the side effects are going to be much more on point, and you're not going to be able to stop them without keeping the dosage lower or stop entirely. Now, there have been some steroid gurus over the years that have said, well, just run finasteride or run dutasteride, and that can help combat the DHT. And that's just not true. With DHT derivative steroids, that's not going to help you. That's going to stop the conversion of DHT from hormones such as testosterone in the body. So if you're running a lot of testosterone and you run finasteride, then yes, it will slow down the DHT conversion. But if you're using a DHT derivative specifically, then there's no drug that you can take to counteract that. So the only thing you can do if you start getting these types of side effects and it's being caused by these DHT steroids, you've got to either stop or you're going to lower your dosage. So let's go over some of the effects. I'm going to go through the list, Mobster, and I'll let you comment on some of these. Head hair loss, because what happens is DHT fries your head hair follicles. So what happens is your head hair follicles get fried. Of course, your hair falls out. So you'll notice when you're running these DHT derivative steroids, there's a good chance that you'll have some head hair loss using them. Just depends on which one you're using and how much. Prostate stress, again, DHT hits the prostate. Skin issues, acne, mood issues, appetite changes, and organ strain can all be side effects of DHT. But the top, I'd say the top one that people complain about, Mobster, is definitely the head hair loss. And that's the one that really people get concerned over. So I always tell people, if you're prone to head hair loss, if everybody in your family loses their hair by the time they're 35 and you're 30 years old and you want to run a bunch of DHT steroid cycles, you're probably going to shed your hair really fucking quick and you'll be bald. In fact, when you look on social media, all these fake natties that you see who claim to be natty, they're all bald for a reason. They're bald by the time they're like 28 because they're abusing the shit out of steroids in their 20s. So really, any steroid that you take will convert to DHT, but then if you take DHT derivatives specifically, you'll get some of these extra side effects. So, Mobster, touch on that.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic because Steve knows we talked about this in the pre-show, and we associate threads that discuss DHT derivatives with this, with the notes with this show, and you can refer to that when you come onto Evolutionary or one of the other places that we post these podcasts, and read some of these threads for yourself. So, for example, Steve, ironically, one, as I said to Steve in the pre-show, they were taking a DHT derivative because they wanted the masculinization. They felt that they didn't have a manly enough jaw, and they also only had a few hairs to call it a beard or facial hair growth. So they actually wanted that side effect. Of course, if you're a woman, that might be an issue. Females, for the most part, do not want a beard or thicker, darker hair on their face. That was one. Another one, as you said quite correctly, Steve, was the issue of trying to prevent hair loss while using DHTs. So that was one right there. There was another thread where the person had created a cycle for themselves, asking their opinion, which we do, of course, a lot on the forums, and they wanted 3 different DHT derivatives to form the basis of that cycle. They wanted to use it for hardening, but we pointed out that perhaps 3 all in one cycle was probably going to be side effects. They were probably going to have issues. And another one, Steve, was, this is number 4 or 5, they wanted to mix 2. And again, I think it was a question of, in their example, of the specific aims that they were asking for, perhaps was better off with 1 and then something else that wasn't a DHT derivative to give them the best overall response in, again, accordance with what they actually wanted. And let me just touch on the hair loss thing and the masculinization. It appeals to a very small percentage of our listeners, the idea of quote unquote being more manly, wherever that actually is, and having a thicker hair on your upper lip or facial hair and having a more manly jaw. Perhaps they feel they look too feminine. I would argue sometimes that's just their overall testosterone levels that they need to look at with a blood test and perhaps not be too overly concerned. I'm the other age, Steve, where shaving's a pain in the ass. Shaving my head is a pain in the ass. And if I didn't have to do it, it wouldn't bother me. But I understand, having been younger, wanting a beard, wanting a moustache, all those kind of things. So, yeah, the head hair loss specifically is, ironically, a major problem. It really, really is. And especially so, again, for the younger towards, I'm going to say up to about 30, 35, Steve, where your connection sometimes between, and I'll put this crudely, your pulling power, your effect on dating may well be connected with how you perceive yourself in terms of your hair and your overall appearance, with or without muscle or size or strength or whatever else. And losing hair can be a massive impact on some people's confidence. The idea of then using something like FINA to counteract these issues, ironically, Steve, as you know, comes with just as many side effects in and of itself. It is used, even correctly, can be a harsh drug to use on your body. And again, you've chosen to use anabolic steroids. Now you're having to add something else into the mix, which is causing you just as many issues as the steroids themselves. Um, I tend towards the shave that bitch, don't worry about it, guys. But I get it. Some people will have that as a particular issue. I think you've talked about this, Steve. You were great with head hair. You have that sort of Persian background, and you've always had no problems with that. But some people are susceptible. For some reason, bearing in mind I shave my head hair, I'm starting to get a lot of adverts on YouTube or whatever else for head hair companies.
I've
Like, I don't know what the algorithms do. What do you think on it anyway, Steve? Before we move on.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed when I'm running anabolic steroids as a whole that my body hair and my facial hair grows faster. I'd say almost twice as faster. But again, if you don't have the genetic effect of being a hairy person, then you may not notice a difference. So those people that you talked about, Mobster, who complain, "Oh, I'm not growing enough body hair, I'm not growing enough facial hair." It's funny because in life we always want the opposite. My cat wants to go outside really bad, and then the cats that are outside, and when it's really cold out there or really hot, they want to come in. They want to be in the safe home and be loved. But my cat wants to go out and is always trying to get out. So we always want the opposite in life. And people, as you said, Mobster, it's a pain in the ass having to shave my face every 2 or 3 days and having to shave my body twice a week. It's a pain in the ass. And so I've spent like thousands of dollars on laser hair removal, and I'm even more hairier after laser hair. So look, at the end of the day, if you want to use it for that purpose, don't waste your time. It's genetic. Hair is genetics. And some people have that genetic addition or subtraction or whatever you want to call it, where their ancestor at some point had to be hairy to survive, better survive than someone who didn't. And there's a reason like Northern Europeans are less hairy than people who are from the Mediterranean area. And there's a reason people from sub-Saharan Africa are less hairy than people from the Mediterranean area. It's different genetics and different evolution that have switched those genetics off and on. So don't use these DHTs for those purposes. That doesn't make any sense. So let's move on to the different DHT steroid options that we're going to talk about. And we'll start off with anadrol. So anadrol is a really weird one. When we're talking about DHT derivatives, it really one. Now there was a time I can remember on forums. If you went on a forum and you said that anadrol was a DHT derivative, you'd have all these self-proclaimed gurus, and we've dealt with these people over the years, Mobster, on our forum. And these people, like, they've literally been shamed off forums at this point. And because they have such little low IQ when it comes to this stuff that they don't get it. But anadrol is a DHT derivative. Okay. But if you've used the anadrol, you've said, my gosh, I don't, it's different because with anadrol, it's actually more advantageous to use it by itself. The other DHT derivatives are not advantageous to use by themselves. They're really, not going to do very much compared to using it in a stack in most situations. So, but anadrol is the one that if you run anadrol for 4 weeks or 5 weeks at 50 milligrams a day, you'll blow up. You'll get big, hard muscles. So anadrol is a weird one because anadrol, even though it doesn't aromatize into estrogen, being a DHT derivative, it still binds to estrogen receptors. So we've seen people over the years run anadrol and end up with gynecomastia. And we've seen people run anadrol and end up with high blood pressure, and they've ended up with water retention. They've ended up with all these side effects that you would think a DHT derivative wouldn't give you. Um, but in this situation, it does. So with anadrol, I always recommend if you get it from Geneza Pharma, they have excellent anadrol. Run 25 to 50 milligrams a day for 4 or 5 weeks and use it by itself. The only other way I would say you could try using it is if you like kickstart in a cycle. If you're running a cycle, like use it in a kickstart. But I would not stack it into a cycle because the side effects are just too fucking brutal. But there's a reason the nickname Mobster for anadrol is A bombs. And I can remember it was very popular in the 90s. There was more of a bulking atmosphere in the 90s where everyone was coming out of the 80s and they were skinny, and everybody wanted to get big. They wanted to get those big monster physiques. So a lot of people were all over anadrol, and also there was a strength effect as well because anadrol is also great for strength. But we've kind of got away from that now, where people want to be more cut and hard. They want more of that zizzy look. They don't want that big bulky look so much, and these trends will change in different parts of the world, different cities. Will obviously, if you're in Southern California, you want to have that nice physique, ripped, physique. If you're in Chicago or Minneapolis, you might want to be more bulky. You might want to be more strong, or the Midwest or something. Just depends on where you're at. Seems like everybody out of the Midwest likes to just go and throw heavy weights around in the gym. They're not so much into aesthetics so much. But like I said, it's a regional thing. It's city by city. Everybody's different. But anadrol is definitely one of those that you want to be aware of the side effects, even though it's a DHT derivative. Monster?
Yeah, I've mentioned to Steve on other shows how I have heard if you respond to Anadrol, especially if you respond well and it's one of your first, second, or third cycles. I've heard stories of people gaining 20 pounds, Steve. And again, you would think, all things being equal, as a DHT derivative, you're talking about 5, maybe 10 pounds. But again, I've taken Anadrol and had next to no response from it, but I was probably then, as I am now, very, very close to my maximal size. Had I tried Anadrol when I first started using steroids, perhaps I would have had one of those crazy responses. I think that's one of those more individual responses, all things being equal, Stephen, dose dependent. I will finish just by saying, as you said already, GP does a GP oxy 50 milligram. Steve, as Steve said already, 25 to 50 milligrams per day. My preference for, and we've discussed this on other shows, would be 4 to 8 weeks. Um, if you've never used it and relative to your age, it's relatively early, keep it down towards the 4 weeks and just see how your body responds. I know that I won't blow up on it, but you might feel differently. You might have a better response. And there's plenty of people out there that have responded in the way Steve said. Arguably, that shouldn't be the case, but Anadrol seems to be a bit of an outlier in that example, Steve. So, yeah, I mean, another example would be, and one of my favorites, as Steve knows, is Anavar. I'm a huge fan. GP does GP Oxan into 10 milligram form. You'd be looking at 30 to 50 milligrams per day. I love Anavar. I've said this multiple times on multiple shows, especially with a great source like Geneza. And uh, I've never gained loads of weight on Anavar. And I'd actually argue, Steve, that my response to this, is obviously one that's similar to most people in terms of 5 pounds gained, all lean muscle. And for me, it's been a great strength boost. What about you, Steve, before we move on?
Anavar is great. Females can run Anavar. It's the number one used steroid for females. Men can use Anavar. So if you're a female, 5 to 10 milligrams is good. If you're a male, 25 to 50 milligrams is good. Using it solo is okay, but you're gonna leave a lot of stuff on the table. So a lot of people they like to stack Anavar with something more androgenic to give it a kick. But you can use it solo. Another one is Primobolan, and Primobolan is an injectable steroid. Geneza Pharma has excellent primobolan. Now, back in the day, you would either have to pay a fortune for primobolan. You would have primobolan that had incredibly nasty post-injection pain. You'd inject it, you'd be on the ground in pain. If you've ever used Bayer Primo back in the day, oh my God, it's like injecting motor oil. It's so thick. It barely even gets through a 23 gauge needle. It's so fucking thick. Or you just get ripped off. So instead of taking Primo, you were taking something else. Maybe Deca, maybe Masteron. I have no idea. But they were basically faking you out because Primobolan is not cheap. But Geneza Pharma not only makes Primobolan that's quality, that's tolerable when it comes to post injection pain, but also that is legit and that's affordable as well. So Primobolan, this was very popular mobster back in the golden age. And 500 milligrams, 400 milligrams, 300 milligrams, anywhere in there would work really good. But with Primobolan, using it solo is sort of a waste. You really want to stack in something. Back in the day, Mobster, they used to stack in a little D-ball with the Primo to give a little kick. Now you can stack a little testosterone with it, and Geneza Pharma has excellent Debo or testosterone to give it a little kick. Arnold was rumored to run Primobolan 700 milligrams a week, and that was really something that he liked Primobolan. They loved it back in the day because of its DHT effects, and it's very mild. It doesn't give you a lot of side effects. So all these DHTs, They have different side effects. Anavar also is mild, doesn't give you many side effects. The next one we're going to talk about, Masteron, doesn't give you many side effects, but it does give you hardening side effects, and it will go after your head hair a lot. So we want to be careful with it. But look, if there was any steroid that professional bodybuilders used and that was popular among the professional bodybuilder world, it would be Masteron. And Geneza Pharma has you covered with both propionate and enanthate with Masteron. Now, with the propionate, it's going to be in your system quicker and it's going to be out of your system quicker. So, if you want the flexibility of getting the hardening effects quickly, you would go with the propionate. Now, if you're doing a little more of a longer cycle or you don't care about flexibility, you can go with enanthate. And that would take a little longer to kick in. It'd take you maybe 2, 3 weeks to start getting those hardening effects. But it's also going to be in your system longer as well. So 500 milligrams a week. I've done Master on 500 milligrams a week. Plenty. That was plenty. If you're a gym rat, you can go 200 or 300 milligrams a week. You can. I've stacked it even at 100 or 150 milligrams a week just to throw it into the cycle, just to get those SHBG benefits, to get those hardening benefits. Very popular stack, Mobster, as you know, is using Masteron with Tren. If you want to do a recomposition and really transform your physique, do Tren, the Geneza Pharma Tren, and Geneza Pharma Masteron. And in most cases, you want to match the esters. So Tren has Tren Ace, Tren E. So you want to, if you're doing Mass Prop, do Tren E with it, run a shorter cycle. If you want to do Mass E and Tren E, do a little longer cycle, and they'd stack well. Mobster, touch upon Primo and Masteron before we move on.
Right, Primo, to be clear, and this is literally just as Steve says, referring to Arnold et al. In the 1970s, was nearly always used to preserve muscle while cutting for competition. In other words, guys, you spend most of the year getting bigger, getting stronger, getting more muscular. And now you want to reveal the results of your hard work. Let's say 9 months of the year, Steve, grinding away to gain another half inch here and a quarter of an inch here, and to show everybody the results on the beach, in the summer, in your tight t-shirt, in your shorts, and especially if you're competing on stage. And it's going to hold on to muscle when you're cutting down the body fat, when sometimes you would lose some of that hard-earned muscle. So the idea sometimes, and I think it comes down to people not having great sources like Geneza, Steve, their gym buddies, etc. So they'll run Primo because that's all they could get. And then they'll go, oh, I didn't gain much muscle. Well, no, you won't. That's why you have to mix it with other steroids, like Steve said. That's why I would expect 3 to 5 pounds, even if I went up as high as a gram, Steve. And I really wouldn't want to, and it's expensive for what you're looking at there. So that's number one. On the Masteron, look, just to sound a tiny bit preachy, guys, it needs to be said. I don't understand sometimes, and we do discuss this on the forums, if someone is 15 or worse, Steve, 18, 19 or 20% body fat, and they say that they want to use Masteron as a hardener, why? If you're not reducing your body fat, if you're not cutting, if you're not getting leaner, yes, your muscles might feel harder to the touch, but they're still covered in a layer of body fat, which means your muscles are harder to see. Now, especially in modern bodybuilding, Steve, over and above Primo, the idea of using a muscle hardener when you are ripped to the bone, as we like to say in competitive bodybuilding, makes a lot of sense. I think the other thing is, Steve, and I will just finish on when we talk about Masteron, it is the second best on the list of normally used steroids at boosting your free testosterone. Provarin, which we'll discuss shortly, is the number one. We've done a whole podcast on Provarin, on SHBG, on boosting free testosterone, and there was literally a list of 10 steroids that was researched in a study, and Provarin was the be-all and end-all. I believe it was 400% above the baseline, which was a form of testosterone, and I believe Masteron was 200% above the baseline. So number one, Provarin, number two, Masteron, and this was for just boosting. So there's definitely a benefit, even with a slightly higher, less lean body fat condition, to using a small dose of Masteron for that boost, getting more out of your cycle. Let's talk about now Provarin, Steve. Again, what did I say earlier on? In and of itself, I think Steve would agree with this. It doesn't do shit. If you wanted to get big, if you wanted to get strong, if you wanted to add more muscle, it's kind of pointless in and of itself. I can't even begin to think of the kind of dosages you'd need to run to get something from it. And again, there are so many better options. But in terms of adding something to a cycle, like a low dose of Masteron as well, Steve, and again, it's number one. We did the whole podcast on this in the past, and I said why. I literally think I said on the forum, Steve, why the fuck haven't I been using Provoron up to now? Why, when I'm doing these shows with Steve, hadn't even registered on my tiny little brain that I wasn't using it? So I literally now, Steve, run 25 milligrams a day. What's that, Steve? 175 milligrams a week total, in addition to whatever else I'm using. As we do this show, I'm running a combination of Sustanon and Nandrolone Decanate at the regular numbers that I normally would. And then I've added the 25 milligrams, the last two cycles, in fact, per day of Provarin to boost the effects of the Sustanon, to boost the effects of Deca, same as I would any other cycle. And that works perfectly for me. How would you dose it, Steve? And again, I'm doing an 8-week cycle. So how would you use Provarin in that circumstance?
Yeah, I think Proviron is a great option too when you're using a Nandrolone, like you said. And I would go because it's not liver toxic. You can be more flexible with it, and run it longer term. So 25 milligrams, if you're doing a long cycle and you want to keep it the whole cycle, would be good. If you're doing it just for a short amount of time, you can go with 50 milligrams. But I've always done 25 milligrams and had really good results with Proviron. So that's the way, I would approach it. And as you said, Monster, it's useless solo. So it's definitely something you always want to add to a cycle anyway. So you can go that way. Next one is Turinabol. And Turinabol is a really good one. If you're into athletics, it's very mild, doesn't have many side effects. I did notice on my last Turinabol cycle when I was in the shower or if I was brushing my hair, I was shedding a little bit of hair. So that's really the only thing you might notice. But it really does a great job for muscle hardening, and it does a good job for creating a lean muscle mass. Now, if you want to use it solo, you can. It's not going to do a lot for you, but but that's kind of a good thing. That's not doing a lot for you because if you like to play tennis or swim or play basketball or do yoga or Pilates or do boot camp training or even CrossFit, it's a very good one because it's not going to fuck with your endurance. So it'll benefit your endurance a little bit, a net. So it's a really good one. And so if you're going to use it solo or if you're going to stack it, you want to go anywhere from 20 to 40 milligrams a day. That's a dose I've always used. I like it a lot at that dose. And I think,
Arguably, Steve, the whole creation of Turinabol, as we've discussed in depth on other shows, is precisely not making you grow too much muscle. Very, very quickly, literally created by Eastern Bloc countries with the support of the communist state, as was Russia at the time, to counteract the supersized, is it a man, is it a woman, athletes that were appearing on the athletics field. Huge big deal at the time in the newspapers and on TV. And so they were stopping their athletes taking anabolic steroids, reducing them in size, reducing some of the horrendous side effects they were having, but maintaining the athletic ability, specifically discus and javelin, putting a shot and so on and so forth, and creating an environment where the athlete was less likely to be tested because they wasn't 300 pounds woman, for example. And I'm exaggerating for the purpose of illustration. And as Steve said, in modern terms and in modern usage, if you have any kind of level of condition, if you play any kind of weekend type activities, as Steve just described, tennis, man on man, basketball, whatever, and you want to gain a little bit of muscle, you want to go to the gym, but you also want to maintain a certain athletic ability. Sometimes on certain, trend would be a good example, Steve, will smash the fuck out of your cardio conditioning. And the idea of maintaining some conditioning while you're on cycle, while you're gaining muscle, while you're training incredibly hard, makes Tyrannoboa incredibly popular. And again, I would argue, Steve, if there are any gains to be added here, and again, it would depend how you run it. It will certainly be lean gains. You're not going, like Anavar, you're not going to put on pounds and pounds of muscle. 3 to 5 pounds might be normal. But again, if you're a conditioned guys, and especially if you're athletic, 3 to 5 pounds of functional muscle in the right place, even 1 or 2 pounds more than that perhaps, looks amazing on an already lean muscular physique. If it's in the right place on your shoulders, if it's the right place on your quads, it can transform your lean muscular physique. And again, you're not doing that kind of muscle building, super strength training and having no conditioning. You're maintaining conditioning. You're still functional. Steve likes to be functional. Tyrannoboa's great for Steve. What about Winstrol, Steve?
Yeah, and if there's another one besides Masteron that pro bodybuilders, physique competitors are using, it's gonna be Winstrol. Winstrol is the best for drying out. It dries you out so much that you're gonna notice your joints are hurting you. And we didn't get into joint problems on the last segment with side effects. That was something that we missed. But with Winstrol, that's
I'll,
what's
I'll, I'll
yeah.
talk about it briefly, Steve. So listen, when we talk about drying out here, we're probably, and especially when we talked about adding bloat and water weight, this is the opposite. If you look at the steroid cycles, and we've done shows on this, of top professional bodybuilders, Winstrol is pretty much a given that's going to appear at some point on a competitive bodybuilder's list of pre-D type products being used to get in shape for a competition. And the reason for that is that you will lose water. But the issue in terms of the side effect, and I'll bring Steve back in, is that you will lose this in and around your joints and soft tissue. So the knees, the elbows, the hips, and so on. To the point where, and I'll let Steve talk about this as well, you can almost have a dry, crinkly type sensation when your body fat is low enough and you've dropped this water because of Winstrol, never mind cutting water for stop or dehydration, just because of Winstrol. And Steve's described it, I believe, as feeling almost crinkly, like a dried piece of elastic. And that's because the synovial fluid, the literal lubricant in and around the joints, the moisture in the tendons and the connective tissue is less than it normally would be. Not perhaps unnaturally so, Steve, but enough that you know. Let's talk about that, but also the benefits as well.
Yeah, and drying you out ahead of a competition. So a lot of people will use the Winstrol toward the end of their cycle or toward the end where their competition is, or if you're going on vacation or you want to look for the beach, etc. So it really does a great job of that, but it does tear your joints up. You want to be aware. Typical dose of Winstrol, 25 to 50. Again, with me, I've always had good results on 25 milligrams. I don't know why people run these crazy amounts. If you're a professional, that's one thing, but if you're a normal gym rat, there's no reason to exceed 50 milligrams of Winstrol. You'll get great results on it for sure. So let's talk about Geneza Pharma a little bit, Mobster. I'll touch on it for a minute. You can do a minute before you finish this up. Look, Geneza Pharma is a great brand, considered top three in the world. They have great prices, fast shipping, and excellent customer service. And pro bodybuilders are using them for a reason. So definitely come on the forum and learn about where you can find Geneza Pharma products. Mobster, finish this up with your final thoughts.
Listen, guys, we like to discuss on these shows great sources like Geneza. We have to tell you why those companies are great sources. Equally, when it comes to in this show's topic, DHT derivatives, we're looking to give you the information that helps benefit you to get the best from your cycles. It's the reason why we talked about those threads that we've seen earlier on and perhaps the mistakes that were being made and tried to help those members of the forum there make the right choices. It's the reason why I used the word optimal earlier on, Steve. We want you to get the best results. We want you to have the best access to information. We try not to be too dramatic in our comments, in our responses, in the information we give. We know that makes for great traction on podcasts. We know it makes for great clickbaity headlines and titles to grab your attention. But we want these shows to be like an encyclopedia, Steve, where you come in and know that we've referenced the information in a proper way, that we're aiming for the typical gym rat type person. When it comes to cycles and dosages and lengths of cycles, we want to make you aware of the side effects. We want you basically, as I said, to get the best from your work. And I used the phrase earlier on, Steve, the best bang for your buck. So understand, re-listen to this show if you need to. Go back and re-listen to the points we made earlier on so that when you put a cycle together, have you made the best choices? Is this the right dosage? Do I understand that if I run this product at this dose, I might get a side effect? Do I have issues with my head hair? Am I lean enough to get the best results? These are the questions we want you to ask and understand when we're giving you this kind of information. I'll just talk about Geneza very quickly for the last minute, Steve. Literally, we talk about shows on these shows all the time, why companies are a great source. When Steve talks about them being number 3 in the world, how do you become number 3 in the world? By putting out great product that works, that can be tried, tested, lab tested, trusted by professionals to be used. You can go on to Geneza itself and look at the products for yourself. You can look at the product and then look at a reseller, an approved seller of that particular product, make comparisons, ask the right questions, make the right choices, and again, get value for money so that when your cycle is being done, you've listened to the show, you get the best results. The leanest, the most muscular, the most cut, the best look you've achieved in all that particular time. And if we played a part for that, Steve, that would be fucking awesome. Please note, we are not doctors and opinions are ours. It is our view and based on our experience of views on the topic. Our podcast are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.